Hi everyone, it's Jenn from McCreath, February 27th, 2015. This is actually an interview. I'm providing answers which have been emailed to me by a student who's doing a project on trans issues in New Brunswick. Interestingly enough, one of my lesser known titles is Jenn from McCreath, Newfoundland trans person who frequently visits New Brunswick to do trans activism, education, and awareness work. So I'm glad that this student has contacted me, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. Number one, do you have any specific experiences with transphobia that you'd like to share? Absolutely. Two types of transphobia. One is blatant discrimination because of inappropriate or insufficient policies or procedures, most often by government entities. Second would be transphobia, in which discrimination is done in a hidden and secret manner to the point where you know it's happening, but it's tough to prove. I lost a so-called safe and secure job in 2009, shortly after I came out as trans in 2008. And I subsequently had a very difficult time finding work after that. In fact, I won several job competitions only to have something come up conveniently, coincidentally, that would either cancel the competition or allow them to hire the runner-up candidate. These are all with the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, provincial government civil service positions, by the way. The Department of Health here in Newfoundland is not very trans-friendly. Their policies are out of date. There's a lot of things they won't cover. So I went to the Human Rights Commission and filed a complaint. And given the limited scope of their abilities, they were not even allowed to hear the case. So the fact that I was being denied services and being denied funding was beyond the scope of the Human Rights Commission. Yet more systemic transphobia. Airport. Customs. Yeah. Ground customs as well. I've crossed the border by air and by car, and many times in my life, and only after being out as a trans person did I face additional extra scrutiny before I was allowed to cross the border. This goes for leaving Canada, going to the United States, as well as leaving the United States and coming into Canada. 1B, what do you find are the most difficult parts of navigating New Brunswick as a member of the trans community? Well, this will have to be in the scope of me as a visitor, as a tourist. Someone who lives close by in Newfoundland, who is looking to create alliances. I'm trying to work with other trans people on national issues. And given the climate of transphobia in New Brunswick, by government and society, it makes it very difficult for me to find trans New Brunswickers in the first place, let alone those who are willing to work on trans issues. A lot of trans people are in the closet. They're afraid to come out and be seen and be heard and to step up to the plate. So essentially, I guess I would have to say the climate of transphobia makes it difficult for any trans person, one, to find other trans people and to work with them. And two, in the context of being a tourist, it's kind of scary being a tourist in a place where you know that you don't have human rights. What happens if I'm vacationing in New Brunswick and have to go to a hospital or some sort of facility? Just the fear of not knowing that you're protected under human rights. Also the fear that there's misinformation, myths, and lack of education, ignorance and intolerance definitely makes it uncomfortable for me or anyone, any trans person, to negotiate New Brunswick. Number two, what are the biggest legal barriers for trans citizens in New Brunswick? What would be the best ways to start addressing them? I think it all has to start with human rights legislation. Gender identity and gender expression need to be added as explicit grounds for protection, with no definitions, no exceptions, no exemptions. Once you have that on paper, we'll get into that later. Other issues, the ease and ability for trans people to have their name legally changed, to have the sex or gender marker changed on identification documents. Government of Ontario recently passed a human rights case saying it's discriminatory to force trans people to have surgery prior to accepting a ID change. That's a problem in New Brunswick. Access to funding for healthcare, sex reassignment surgeries should be covered. Policy, there needs to be recognition by the Department of Health in New Brunswick that the WPATH standards of care will be accepted and adopted and applied by Newfoundland doctors. Any patient who follows the standards of care should be given appropriate and timely treatment and funding for services. The New Brunswick Human Rights Commission needs to have the scope and the tools to do education and awareness and outreach work to promote understanding of trans issues in the province. Best way to address them. I think I've covered that, haven't I? Do the current grounds of sex or sexual orientation sufficiently protect trans people in New Brunswick? I'm going to say no. Having implied protection is nice. There are legal precedents that would demonstrate that. However, additional challenges have been proven in other jurisdictions. If a person is victimized, facing discrimination due to gender identity or gender expression, they need to somehow demonstrate their argument that their discrimination also fits the legal definition of sex or sexual orientation as is understood by the courts and by precedents in law. It requires a lot of extra research work by lawyers, which can make it a lot more challenging to plead your case in a court of law or in a human rights tribunal hearing. Furthermore, I will point out that it's better to not have explicit protection if there are exemptions and definitions. We are seeing federally Bill C-279, an amendment suggesting that protection should be limited to trans people only under certain circumstances. The minute you start defining trans people, as well as picking out times and places where they are not granted protection, you might as well not even have the act. How do you think specific human rights protection, gender identity, gender expression, could help the current situation for trans people in New Brunswick? First of all, I'd say creating the terms gender identity and gender expression validates that we exist and recognizes that gender identity, which is who you see yourself as, and gender expression, how you express your identified gender, have nothing to do with and are completely different and separate from sex, sexual orientation, or disability. Number two, it allows tracking of statistics. Complaints can now be filed citing these specific categories rather than having to use something else. So we can start to track the amount of discrimination complaints and discrimination episodes and instances. Two, when you put something in a government act, it validates something as being deemed acceptable, and it makes it a lot easier to use moral suasion to convince society to jump on board and understand and accept this. It'll make it a lot easier for Department of Health and Department of Educations to amend their policies to ensure that better education and awareness of these issues is there, and that appropriate best practice services are provided to trans people. It can also lead to pressure to conform. We now have 4 provinces that have gender identity and gender expression in their human rights codes, along with 2 others that have gender identity. That leaves only 4 left. The pressure's on the 4 of you provinces that haven't done this yet. And it also helps put pressure on the federal government, and it puts pressure on other countries in the world. There's a standard to uphold, and being cutting edge, being upfront, being leaders requires that you do this. I hope that was helpful. If there's anything else you can think of in terms of a question, feel free to ask. Thanks for watching.